I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm the instructor for the portrait sculpting course and the figure sculpting course over at Proko.com. And in this video, I'm going to be sculpting a caricature of the man, the myth, the legend, Stan Prokopenko. Throughout this video, I'm going to be following the 10 steps to a successful portrait sculpture that I go over in a video over on the Proko 3D YouTube channel. So if you're interested in those steps, you can check out that video for more information. All right, the first step is collecting plenty of reference material. Fortunately for me, Court Jones does an awesome job of creating some really fun caricature sketches of Stan in one of the lessons in his course on the art of caricature. I'll use these sketches as inspiration, as well as grabbing some reference images and videos of Stan from his previous lessons. The second step is building the armature. For this armature, it's just a simple nail nailed into a baseboard and then some paper and masking tape to make this popsicle-shaped armature. And I'll be using Chavant medium NSP clay. Once the armature is covered in a thin layer of clay, then we can move on to step 3, which is creating a simple block-in. And we can do this by adding a piece of clay to represent the facial mass of the portrait. Next, in step 4, is capturing the likeness from the side profile view. I'll do this by adding a big old mohawk with a piece of clay to get the general shape of the head and hairline. I'll also make an indication of the forehead and nose and mouth just to give a little bit more information to the profile. One of the things that Court Jones mentioned in his lesson when he was doing caricatures of Stan is that Stan has kind of a baby face.
Even with his heavy eyebrows and manly stubble, he still has kind of a baby face.
And that he has kind of a beet-shaped head.
I've determined that Stan's spirit animal is a beet.
So baby face, beet-shaped head, and those are the things that I kind of wanted to play with in this sculpture. Step number 5 is adding the bony structures. So this will include things like the brow ridge. But because I'm doing a more baby-faced version of the portrait, I don't need to go in and sculpt all of the anatomical features of the skull. But I do want to go ahead and add some clay towards the back of the head and try to capture the structure of the head all the way around. Step 6 is working on the likeness from the front view. And once I have these roughed out cross sections of the shape of the head from the front view and then the shape of the head from the side view, I can then take clay and fill out the areas in between. Babies and toddlers tend to have a really large cranial mass of the head and then smaller facial features. So I want the back of the head and the forehead to be quite large and then taper quite a bit as it transitions to the chin. Step 7 is checking the portrait. I have lessons that go over many different methods for checking your portrait, so if you're interested in any of the concepts that I talk about in this video, be sure to check out the links in the description below. Butter knife works great to add a center line and some guidelines. Something helpful when you're working on the portrait is to look at the sculpture from above. From this angle, it's a little bit easier to see if there's parts of the sculpture that are asymmetrical or lopsided. One of the main things is obviously to be observing your references. So as I'm sculpting, I have at hand the reference images of Stan from different angles, as well as the caricature sketches from Court Jones that are serving as inspiration for this sculpture. Drawing in guidelines with a tool or butter knife can be really helpful, and it can actually speed up the process of sculpting, because if you make any mistakes in the drawing, it's much easier to fix that than adding or removing pieces of clay. Step 8 is working around the sculpture from every angle. This is something that I did start to do fairly early on in the sculpting process. So this is an example of how some of these steps can kind of bleed into one another, and you can kind of sometimes work on multiple steps at the same time. But if you do make any errors, that means you have to go back and correct previous steps. And so that's why if you're just beginning, I really recommend following each of the steps and then checking that step before moving on, because you'll have to redo a lot less of the sculpting process. So now I'm working around the sculpture and slowly starting to develop the features of the ears, the nose, the mouth, the structure around the eyes. This part of the sculpting process just takes time and patience. With sculpting, I always recommend starting out thin and then slowly building out the thickness of the portrait with small pieces of clay. When you're sculpting the portrait and you're working around the portrait, it's really crucial not to neglect areas like the back of the head. The back of the head is often an area that we don't pay as much attention to as the rest of the portrait because it's not as interesting. But capturing the back of the head is actually really important for creating a good portrait sculpture. Whether you're sculpting a caricature or a more realistic portrait, paying attention to those little areas like the back of the head can take your sculpture from looking amateur to more professional. Step number 9 is all about developing the details of the facial features. Because I'm sculpting at about a half-life size scale, this means that I can start to use tools to refine and define the forms of the head. And if you're struggling with any particular facial feature, just remember that there's video lessons that go over all of the facial features over on the Proko 3D YouTube channel. So if you're interested in sculpting, be sure to subscribe over on that channel. Step number 9 can take some time, and when it comes to sculpting, generally slow is fast. And what I mean by that is if you're slow enough to take the time to really be careful where you're adding those little pieces of clay, then you won't have to redo as much of the work or move things around as much, and it's actually much quicker to move slowly and carefully as you're building out those forms. Step 10 is texturing the sculpture. I personally tend to like a fairly smooth texture, but I don't go through the trouble of removing all of the tool marks. Depending on the level of detail you're going for, this stage of the sculpting process can take quite a bit of time as well. But if you've done all of the previous steps accurately, then it makes this step of texturing much easier. And this stage is where I add things like the wrinkles on the forehead, the details of the ears, and the texture of the hair. Texturing is all about bringing the whole sculpture to the same level and making sure that there aren't any areas that feel underdeveloped or out of place. For this caricature portrait, the whole sculpting process took about 8 or 9 hours over a week or so. So if you're disciplined enough to set just a little bit of time aside every day to sculpt a little bit, then it really is possible to create some really fun works of art. And every work of art you create, you get a little bit better and you learn a little bit more. Once I was happy with a sculpture, I made a simple, cheap mold. And yes, there's a free lesson that goes over my method for that over on the Proko 3D channel. And I cast it in plaster and attached it to a wood base. And here you have one caricature sculpture of Stan Prokopenko. Stan has done such an amazing job of creating some of the best resources for artists to learn online. And I'm so grateful to be just a small part of this growing Proko platform. Be sure to check out Court Jones's course on the art of caricature if you're interested in this fun and expressive art form. You can find that over at proko.com/caricature. If you'd like to get better at sculpting people in clay, consider getting the portrait sculpting course over at proko.com/portrait sculpt. In the premium course, I'm going to have a longer guided demo of this sculpture as well as many other sculpting assignments. So if that sounds interesting, I hope you'll invest in the full course. Stay creative. Stay productive.